Jack and Mike had been talking about this fishing trip for what felt like forever. Life had gotten busy, as it tends to, and they hadn't had a chance to really get away from it all since their college days. Both in their early 30s now, with jobs that seemed to demand more and more of their time, this trip to Lake Serpent was meant to be a much-needed escape, a chance to unwind, catch up, and enjoy the simplicity of being out on the water. The drive to Lake Serpent was long, but the excitement made it feel shorter than it was. They left early in the morning, the sun just beginning to peek over the horizon as they loaded up Jack's old truck with fishing gear, coolers packed with food and drinks, and a few essentials for the weekend. The road to the lake took them through winding mountain passes and dense forests, the kind of place where phone signals disappeared and the outside world seemed a million miles away. Just what they needed. As they neared their destination, the landscape grew wilder. Towering pines lined the narrow dirt road that led to the lake, their branches interlocking above like a natural cathedral. The forest felt ancient, untouched by time. Even the air smelled different, cleaner, purer, with the scent of pine and earth filling the cab of the truck. "Man, this is going to be great," Mike said, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. He leaned forward, peering through the windshield as the trees began to thin, revealing glimpses of sparkling blue water. "Just us, the lake, and a bunch of fish that don't stand a chance." Jack smiled, though he couldn't shake a slight unease that had crept up on him during the last leg of the journey. He chalked it up to the usual pre-trip jitters, nothing unusual, just the anticipation of finally getting away from it all. But still, something about the way the trees crowded in close to the road, how the sky seemed to be darkening despite the forecast for clear skies, left him with a strange feeling in the pit of his stomach. As they pulled up to the cabin, any lingering doubts were quickly overshadowed by the beauty of the place. The cabin sat on the edge of Lake Serpent, its wooden beams weathered but sturdy, the large porch overlooking the calm, glassy water. A small dock extended into the lake, where a little rowboat bobbed gently with the current. The cabin looked like something out of a postcard, quaint, cozy, and completely isolated. The only sound was the soft lapping of water against the shore and the distant call of a loon echoing across the lake. "This is perfect," Mike said, already hauling his gear out of the truck. "I can't believe we finally made it out here." Jack nodded, grabbing his own bags and following Mike to the porch. The moment he stepped out of the truck, the unsettling stillness hit him again, stronger this time. The quiet was almost too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. No rustle of leaves in the trees, no chirping of birds, just silence. He shook it off, forcing a grin. "Yeah, it's amazing," he agreed, though his voice sounded oddly flat to his own ears. They spent the next hour or so unpacking and setting up. The cabin was just as picturesque inside as it was out, with a stone fireplace, wooden furniture, and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. Mike immediately claimed the larger bedroom with a view of the lake, while Jack settled into the smaller room at the back. Everything was perfect, yet Jack couldn't help but notice how the stillness seemed to permeate the entire cabin. Even the air felt heavy, like a storm was brewing despite the clear skies. After they were settled, the two friends sat on the porch, beers in hand, watching the sun begin its slow descent toward the horizon. The sky was streaked with purples and oranges, reflecting off the lake surface like a painting. It should have been the perfect moment, just two old friends, catching up and enjoying the peace they had been craving for so long. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence was oppressive now, the kind that made your ears ring. It wasn't the soothing quiet of nature, it was the kind that pressed in on you, filling every corner of your mind. He glanced over at Mike, who was staring out at the lake, oblivious to anything but the view. "You feel that?" Jack finally asked, his voice breaking the silence like a splash of cold water. I don't know. It just feels different here." Mike looked at him, raising an eyebrow. "Different? Like what?" "I don't know. Just quiet. Too quiet." Mike chuckled, shaking his head. "That's the whole point, man. We're out in the middle of nowhere. No cars, no people, no noise. Just us and the lake. Jack nodded, forcing himself to relax. Maybe Mike was right. Maybe he was just too used to the constant noise of the city, and this was just his mind's way of adjusting. He took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. As the last rays of sunlight faded and the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Jack tried to push his unease aside. This was supposed to be a time for relaxation, for leaving all their worries behind. He took another sip of his beer, focusing on the sound of the water lapping against the shore, trying to convince himself that the stillness was just what they needed. But as the darkness settled in, that strange feeling in his gut refused to fade, whispering that something wasn't quite right in this serene little corner of the world. With the truck unloaded and their gear organized, Jack and Mike quickly settled into the rhythm of cabin life. They stacked their fishing rods by the door, prepped the tackle box, and arranged their supplies on the small wooden table in the corner of the main room. The cabin, though modest, had everything they needed: a small kitchen, a couple of old but comfortable chairs by the stone fireplace, and 2 simple bedrooms. The isolation was absolute, and for the most part, it was exactly what they had been looking forward to. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall pines surrounding the cabin, casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, the lake shimmered in the golden light, its surface still and undisturbed. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the soft murmur of the wind through the trees. It was the kind of quiet that city dwellers dream of, the perfect backdrop for unwinding. Mike was in his element, moving around the cabin with an ease that spoke of his excitement. He checked the fishing gear one last time, making sure everything was in order for the morning. "Man, this place is perfect," he said, his voice full of anticipation. "Tomorrow's going to be great. I can feel it." Jack nodded in agreement, though that odd sense of unease still lingered at the back of his mind. He busied himself with small tasks, unpacking his clothes, setting up his bed, and making sure the cooler was well stocked. But every so often, he'd find himself pausing, listening, as if waiting for something out of place. The stillness that had seemed so inviting earlier now felt a bit too heavy, as if the cabin and the surrounding woods were holding their breath. As evening fell, the 2 friends stepped out onto the porch to watch the sunset. The sky was painted in hues of pink and orange, and the reflection on the lake was almost surreal. They cracked open a couple of beers and sat in silence, taking in the view. It was beautiful, no doubt, and yet Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Hey, you all right?" Mike asked, noticing Jack's distracted expression. "Yeah, just... I don't know. Maybe it's the quiet. It's almost too quiet, you know?" Jack replied, trying to put his unease into words. Mike chuckled. "That's why we're here, right? To get away from the noise and the craziness. You're just not used to it. A few days out here, and you'll wonder how you ever lived with all that city racket." Jack smiled, knowing Mike was probably right. He took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill his lungs. They had come all this way to relax, and here he was, letting his nerves get the better of him. He pushed the thoughts aside, determined to enjoy the peace and quiet that surrounded them. As the last light of the day faded and the stars began to appear, they retreated inside. Mike built a small fire in the fireplace, its warmth quickly spreading through the cabin, making it feel even cozier. They talked for a while, reminiscing about old times, sharing a few laughs, and planning out their fishing spots for the next day. Eventually, the weariness from the long drive and the day's activities set in. They both decided to turn in early, eager to get a good night's sleep before their big day on the lake. Mike was out like a light as soon as his head hit the pillow, but Jack lay awake for a while, staring up at the ceiling of his small room. The cabin was utterly silent now, save for the occasional pop of the dying fire in the next room. The darkness felt thicker than usual, pressing in from all sides, and Jack found himself straining to hear something, anything, that might break it. But there was nothing. Just that same, suffocating stillness. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to relax. It was just nerves, he told himself. The stress of work, the excitement of the trip, the sudden change in environment, it was all playing tricks on his mind. He had to get a grip, focus on the positive, and let himself enjoy the escape. Finally, as exhaustion took over, Jack drifted off to sleep. But even in his dreams, that strange feeling lingered, like a shadow lurking at the edges of his consciousness, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The morning sun had barely begun to rise when Jack and Mike were already up and getting ready for their day on the lake. The air was crisp and cool, with a light mist hovering over the water, giving the whole scene an almost otherworldly feel. The excitement of the day ahead had pushed aside any lingering unease Jack felt the night before. Today was about fishing, and nothing was going to spoil that. They carried their gear down to the dock, their breath visible in the cold morning air. The lake was calm, its surface like glass, reflecting the pale blue of the early morning sky. Everything was quiet, save for the gentle creak of the wooden boards beneath their feet and the soft splash of water as they launched the small rowboat. "This is what it's all about," Mike said with a grin as he pushed off from the dock, the oars slicing through the still water. Jack nodded in agreement, letting the calm wash over him. This was the escape they had been craving, the perfect start to their fishing trip. They rowed out to the middle of the lake, where the water was deep and the fish were rumored to be plentiful. The boat drifted lazily as they set up their rods, baiting their hooks and casting their lines with the ease of seasoned fishermen. The minutes ticked by in peaceful silence, the only sounds the occasional chirp of a bird or the soft plop of a lure hitting the water. Jack leaned back in the boat, closing his eyes and soaking in the tranquility. It was as if all the tension of the past few months was being slowly drawn out of him, replaced by the simple joy of being out on the water with his best friend. They'd catch some fish, have a few laughs, and just enjoy the day. Nothing else mattered. It wasn't long before Mike's rod bent sharply, the tip dipping dangerously close to the water. "Got something," he exclaimed, excitement in his voice as he began to reel it in. But the line wasn't behaving the way it should. Instead of the rapid, erratic jerks of a fish fighting for freedom, the line seemed to be pulling steadily, almost like whatever was on the other end was being dragged up from the depths. "Must be a big one," Mike grunted, his knuckles white as he gripped the rod. But Jack noticed the tension in his friend's face, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Mike was strong, and it wasn't often that he struggled with a catch like this. "Need help?" Jack offered, leaning forward to grab the net, ready to assist. "Maybe. I don't know what this is," Mike replied, his voice strained. The line was heavy, too heavy, and whatever was attached to it was rising slowly, almost reluctantly, from the bottom of the lake. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, something broke the surface with a soft splash. But it wasn't a fish. It was an old, waterlogged object, roughly the size of a small chest, covered in algae and muck. It bobbed there in the water, looking out of place in the pristine lake. "What the hell is that?" Jack murmured, leaning closer to get a better look. The object was ancient, judging by the layers of grime and the way the wood had darkened with age. Strange markings were barely visible beneath the filth, symbols that neither of them recognized. Mike hauled it into the boat, his brow furrowed in confusion. The chest was heavier than it looked, water dripping from its sides as it landed with a thud on the wooden planks between them. They stared at it, a strange silence falling over the lake, as if the world itself was holding its breath. "This is weird, man," Mike finally said, his voice quiet. "Really weird." Jack nodded, his earlier sense of unease creeping back in with a vengeance. The calm, peaceful morning had taken on a different tone, the air suddenly feeling colder, the lake more ominous. He didn't like the look of that chest, didn't like the way it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. "Maybe we should just leave it," Jack suggested, though he knew it was a long shot. Mike was too curious, too intrigued to let it go now. But before Mike could respond, the wind picked up, sending a shiver through both of them. The water, once so calm, began to ripple, small waves lapping against the sides of the boat. The mist that had hung over the lake thickened, swirling around them like a living thing, making it hard to see more than a few feet in any direction. Mike glanced at Jack, his expression a mix of curiosity and caution. "Let's just take it back to the cabin," he said, though there was hesitation in his voice. "We'll figure out what it is later." Jack agreed, though his gut told him that whatever they had pulled from the lake, it was better left where it had been. But it was too late now. The chest was in the boat, and they were heading back to shore, the once peaceful lake now feeling strangely hostile. As they rowed back, the eerie silence returned, broken only by the sound of the oars cutting through the water and the occasional creak of the boat. The chest sat between them, a silent, foreboding presence, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they had disturbed something that was better left undisturbed. This fishing trip had taken a turn, and Jack had a sinking feeling that it was only the beginning of something far more unsettling. Back at the cabin, the eerie atmosphere from the lake seemed to follow Jack and Mike, clinging to them like a damp mist. The box, ancient and waterlogged, sat on the cabin's small kitchen table, dripping lake water onto the wooden surface. The strange symbols etched into its surface seemed even more pronounced in the dim light of the cabin, almost as if they were glowing faintly. Jack couldn't help but stare at it, a deep unease gnawing at him. He had a bad feeling about this, but Mike was too caught up in the mystery to notice. Mike grabbed a towel, trying to wipe away some of the grime and muck that had accumulated on the box over who knows how many years. "This is incredible," he muttered, more to himself than to Jack. "I've never seen anything like it." Jack hovered nearby, his unease growing with every passing second. "I don't know, Mike. Maybe we should just leave it alone. We don't know what this thing is, or how long it's been down there." But Mike was already too deep in his curiosity to be swayed. "Come on, Jack. How often do you find something like this? It could be an artifact, or something valuable. We have to open it." Reluctantly, Jack watched as Mike began to search for a way to open the box. The lid was sealed shut, no visible lock or hinge, just those strange markings running along the edges. After a few moments of fiddling, Mike found a small indentation near the base, barely noticeable under the layers of grime. He pressed it, and with a low, grinding sound, the lid began to lift. A cold draft seemed to sweep through the cabin the moment the box was opened, causing the flames in the fireplace to flicker and the temperature to drop noticeably. Jack shivered, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He glanced around nervously, half expecting something, or someone, to step out of the shadows. Inside the box, instead of gold or jewels, lay a collection of old, tattered scrolls, each one wrapped tightly and sealed with wax. There was also a small, intricately carved stone figure, its features worn smooth by time. The figure was unsettling, with hollow eyes and an expression that seemed to change depending on how the light hit it. Mike reached for one of the scrolls, but Jack grabbed his wrist, stopping him. "Maybe we shouldn't mess with this," Jack said, his voice tense. "We don't know what any of this means." But Mike shook him off, determined to see this through. "Don't be so paranoid, Jack. It's just old paper and stone. Let's see what's inside." He broke the seal on the scroll and carefully unrolled it on the table. The parchment was brittle, but the writing, if that's what it was still visible, though completely indecipherable. Strange symbols and patterns covered the page, similar to those on the box, but more intricate, almost hypnotic. Jack felt a deep unease looking at them, as if they were meant for eyes not of this world. As Mike leaned in closer to study the scroll, the cabin seemed to grow even colder. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, making the walls creak and groan. Jack's unease turned into full-blown anxiety. Something wasn't right. It was as if the very air around them had shifted, becoming thicker, harder to breathe. The light filtering in through the windows seemed dimmer, and the shadows in the corners of the room grew darker, deeper. "Mike, I'm serious. We need to stop," Jack said, his voice urgent. He could feel the pulse of something in the air, something dark and ancient, something that didn't belong here. But Mike was too absorbed in his discovery to listen. "Just a little longer," he insisted, his eyes glued to the scroll. "There's got to be some kind of clue here. This could be the find of a lifetime." Suddenly, the fire in the hearth flared up, casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls. The figure in the box seemed to move, though Jack knew it was impossible. The air grew colder still, and Jack swore he heard a faint whisper, though he couldn't make out the words. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, responding to the intrusion, the violation of something that had been hidden and forgotten for a reason. Finally, even Mike seemed to sense that something was wrong. He looked up from the scroll, his face pale. "Maybe you're right, Jack," he said quietly, the excitement drained from his voice. "Maybe we should put this back." But as they moved to close the box, the cabin gave an ominous creak, as if in protest. The shadows lengthened, creeping across the floor toward them. The wind outside howled louder, rattling the windows. Jack's heart raced, his mind screaming at him to get out, to leave this place and never look back. They quickly shoved the scrolls back into the box, slamming the lid shut. But the sense of unease didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, more oppressive. The cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in around them. As they stood there, staring at the sealed box, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they had unleashed something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. The lake, the cabin, the very ground beneath their feet, it all felt wrong now, as if they had crossed an invisible line. And there was no going back. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the cabin's comforting warmth seemed to drain away with the daylight. The shadows that had lingered harmlessly in the corners earlier now stretched and deepened, turning the once cozy cabin into a place of uncertainty. The box, now sealed and shoved into the corner of the room, seemed to radiate a malevolent energy, as though its presence alone had tainted the very air around them. Jack and Mike tried to settle in for the evening, but the atmosphere inside the cabin had changed. What had been peaceful and inviting now felt charged with something unspoken, something neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Mike attempted to shake off the tension by preparing dinner, but even the simple act of cooking felt strained, as if the cabin itself resisted their attempts at normalcy. After a meal that neither of them truly enjoyed, they stepped outside to get some fresh air, hoping that the night sky would offer some relief. The moon hung low and heavy, casting an eerie glow over the lake, which now seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light. The water, which had been so calm and clear earlier, appeared to ripple without cause, as though disturbed by an invisible hand. "Do you see that?" Jack asked, pointing to the water. The way it glowed under the moonlight wasn't normal. It almost looked alive, the light pulsing softly like a heartbeat. "Yeah, I see it," Mike replied, his voice low. He squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Could be some kind of algae or something, right?" "Maybe," Jack said, though he didn't believe it. There was something off about the way the light danced on the surface, something that made his skin crawl. The air was thick with attention he couldn't shake, and he couldn't ignore the feeling that they were being watched, by what, he couldn't say. As they stood on the porch, a strange sound came from the woods, a low rustling that could have been the wind, but carried a weight to it that felt unnatural. It wasn't just one sound, but a series of noises, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, something large moving through the underbrush. Jack's mind immediately leapt to the possibility of wildlife, but deep down, he knew that wasn't it. There was an intelligence to the movement, a purpose, as if whatever was out there was circling the cabin, studying them. "Probably just a deer or something," Mike offered, though his voice was tinged with doubt. He was trying to convince himself as much as Jack, but the look in his eyes betrayed his true feelings. "Yeah, probably," Jack muttered, his eyes fixed on the tree line. But he couldn't shake the image of something lurking just beyond the reach of the moonlight, something watching them with unseen eyes. The wind picked up, whipping through the trees and sending chills down their spines. The strange noises continued, now accompanied by an occasional low, mournful sound that echoed across the lake, almost like a distant wail. The glowing water seemed to pulse in response, the light growing brighter and then dimming, as if in tune with the unsettling sounds from the woods. They retreated back into the cabin, but even indoors, the sense of unease didn't leave them. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old wood seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. The walls felt too close, the ceiling too low, as if the cabin itself were closing in around them. They tried to distract themselves, talking about anything other than the strange occurrences, but the conversation was forced, stilted. Jack found himself glancing at the box more and more, its presence in the room a constant reminder of what they had done earlier. The markings on it seemed to shift in the dim light, playing tricks on his mind. He wanted to believe it was all just their imagination, that the strange atmosphere was just the product of a long day and too much time spent thinking about that damned box. But deep down, he knew better. Finally, they decided to call it a night, hoping that sleep would bring some clarity in the morning. But as they lay in their respective beds, the silence was anything but comforting. The noises from outside continued, now accompanied by what sounded like soft footsteps on the porch, just outside their door. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he strained to listen, every nerve on edge. "Did you hear that?" Mike whispered from the other room, confirming that Jack wasn't the only one who had noticed. "Yeah," Jack whispered back, his voice barely audible. "Just stay quiet." The footsteps paused, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, a soft scratching sound started at the door, faint but unmistakable. It was a sound that sent chills through both of them, like nails dragging slowly across the wood. Jack lay frozen, his mind racing. Was it an animal? Something else? He didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, for fear of what might happen next. The scratching stopped as suddenly as it had started, and the cabin fell into an oppressive silence. But sleep was impossible now, the feeling of being watched too intense to ignore. Jack's thoughts raced, going back to the box, to the strange symbols, to the way the lake had glowed in the moonlight. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a line, disturbed something ancient and powerful that wasn't meant to be disturbed. Hours passed, and the night dragged on, each sound, each creak of the cabin only heightening their fear. The feeling of being watched never left, the oppressive weight of unseen eyes following their every move. It wasn't until the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows that Jack finally felt a semblance of relief. But even then, the fear lingered, a dark cloud hanging over them, warning them that the worst was yet to come. Next morning, Jack woke up feeling uneasy, the memory of the previous night's strange occurrences still fresh in his mind. As he got dressed, he tried to shake off the lingering fear, convincing himself that it was just his imagination running wild. The sun was shining, and the lake looked as calm and inviting as ever. Today would be better, he told himself. Mike was already up, rummaging through their gear. "Hey, Jack, did you move the fishing rods?" he called out, a hint of confusion in his voice. Jack frowned. "No, they were by the door, right?" "Yeah, but they're not here now," Mike replied, his voice tight with concern. Jack joined him at the door, and sure enough, several pieces of their gear were missing, the fishing rods, a tackle box, and even some smaller items. They searched the cabin thoroughly, but the missing equipment was nowhere to be found. The sense of unease that Jack had been trying to ignore came rushing back. "This doesn't make any sense," Jack muttered, glancing around as if expecting to see someone or something lurking nearby. "We packed everything up last night. How could it just disappear?" Mike's face was pale, and his usual confident demeanor had been replaced with uncertainty. Maybe an animal got in? But how would it carry off all this stuff? Jack shook his head, his mind racing through possibilities, none of which made sense. The cabin was isolated, miles away from the nearest town, and they hadn't seen or heard anyone else since they arrived. The idea of foul play seemed far-fetched, but what other explanation was there? The more they searched, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. The forest outside, once serene and welcoming, now seemed ominous, the trees casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. The stillness of the air, the absence of birdsong, it all felt wrong. "Mike, I don't like this," Jack said, his voice low. "Something's not right here. Maybe we should think about packing up and heading back." Mike hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting something to jump out at them. "Yeah, maybe you're right. But let's take one last look around outside, just in case." They stepped off the porch, the cool morning air doing little to calm their nerves. As they circled the cabin, the feeling of being watched only intensified. The forest was silent, too silent, as if it was holding its breath. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made them jump, their eyes searching the shadows for something that wasn't there. After an uneasy search, they returned to the cabin empty-handed. The missing gear was gone, vanished without a trace, leaving them with more questions than answers. The sense of dread was overwhelming now, and both Jack and Mike knew that something was terribly wrong. "This trip isn't what we thought it would be," Jack said quietly, his voice trembling. "We need to get out of here, before things get worse." Mike nodded, the fear in his eyes mirroring Jack's own. They had come to the lake seeking peace and relaxation, but what they found instead was something far darker, something that made them feel like they were no longer alone. Despite the unsettling events of the morning, Jack and Mike were determined not to let their trip be ruined. After all, they had come here to fish, and they weren't about to leave without at least trying to enjoy the lake one more time. The sun was high, the sky clear, and the water, though eerily calm, looked as inviting as ever. "Let's just put all that weird stuff behind us," Mike said, trying to sound upbeat as they loaded the remaining gear into the boat. "We're probably overreacting. A day out on the water is exactly what we need." Jack nodded, though the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. He still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but he pushed it down, not wanting to ruin the trip further. They rowed out to the middle of the lake, the oars cutting through the water with steady, rhythmic strokes. The lake's surface was smooth, reflecting the bright blue sky, but Jack noticed that the water had taken on an odd, dark hue, as if something was lurking just beneath. They set up their lines and cast them out, the lures plunking into the water with small splashes. For a while, everything was peaceful. They sat in companionable silence, the tension from earlier slowly ebbing away as they focused on the familiar routine of fishing. But Jack couldn't help but notice how the water seemed to ripple in places where there was no wind, as if something was moving beneath the surface. Then, suddenly, Mike's line went taut. His rod bent sharply, and for a moment, there was an excited glint in his eyes. "I've got something," he called out, gripping the rod tightly as whatever was on the other end fought back. But this wasn't like the usual struggle with a big fish. The force pulling on the line was powerful, almost violent, and the boat began to rock as Mike struggled to maintain control. Jack watched, his heart pounding, as Mike's grip slipped, and the rod was nearly yanked from his hands. "Careful!" Jack shouted, moving to help, but before he could reach him, Mike was pulled forward with a sudden, terrifying jerk. The boat lurched violently, and in an instant, Mike was yanked overboard, disappearing into the dark water with a splash. "Mike!" Jack screamed, adrenaline surging through him as he lunged toward the spot where his friend had vanished. The water churned violently, as if something massive was thrashing beneath the surface. Jack could barely make out Mike's form struggling beneath the waves, being dragged deeper by an unseen force. Without thinking, Jack grabbed a nearby oar and plunged it into the water, reaching desperately for Mike. His fingers brushed against something, Mike's arm. Jack gripped it with all his strength, pulling with everything he had. But whatever had hold of Mike wasn't letting go easily. The struggle felt like it lasted an eternity. Jack's muscles burned, his heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let go. Inch by inch, he managed to drag Mike closer to the surface until, finally, with one last mighty heave, Mike broke free of the water's grasp and was pulled into the boat. They collapsed together in the bottom of the boat, both gasping for air, soaked to the bone. Mike was trembling, his eyes wide with shock and fear. "What the hell was that?" he panted, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack didn't have an answer. His mind was reeling, trying to process what had just happened. He looked out over the water, which had returned to its unnatural calm, the ripples from their struggle already fading away. But he knew, deep down, that something terrible was lurking beneath the surface, something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. "We need to get out of here," Jack said, his voice shaking. "Now." Mike nodded weakly, still too shaken to argue. They quickly reeled in their lines and grabbed the oars, rowing back to shore with a speed born of fear. Every splash of the oars felt like it was echoing across the lake, but they didn't dare look back. The sense of being watched had returned, stronger than ever, and they knew they had pushed their luck too far. As they finally reached the shore and scrambled out of the boat, Jack turned back to the lake one last time. The surface was calm, the water dark and impenetrable. But he could feel it, whatever was down there wasn't done with them yet. and it wasn't going to let them leave so easily. The row back to the cabin felt like the longest journey of their lives. Jack and Mike were drenched, shivering not just from the cold, but from the terror of what had just happened. The lake, which had once seemed so inviting, now loomed behind them like a dark, malevolent force. They didn't speak, too rattled to do anything but focus on reaching the safety of solid ground. When they finally made it to the shore, they dragged the boat onto the dock with trembling hands and bolted up the path to the cabin. The sense of dread followed them with every step, as if the very air around them was closing in. Once inside, they slammed the door shut and immediately began barricading it with whatever they could find: chairs, the heavy wooden table, even their bags. They secured the windows, drawing the curtains tight and pushing furniture against them, though neither of them voiced the fear that was gnawing at their minds. What if the thing from the lake could get in? They collapsed onto the floor, backs against the barricaded door, hearts still racing. The small cabin, once a refuge, now felt more like a prison. The familiar, cozy surroundings were tainted by the terror they had just experienced, the warmth of the fireplace doing little to chase away the chill that had settled in their bones. "What the hell was that, Jack?" Mike finally asked, his voice trembling, eyes wide with fear. "What pulled me under?" "There was something down there, something alive." "I don't know," Jack replied, his voice hollow. He was trying to keep it together, but the fear was gnawing at him, making it hard to think straight. "Whatever it was, it's not natural. We need to stay inside, keep the doors and windows locked. Maybe it'll go away." But even as he said it, Jack didn't believe it. The atmosphere inside the cabin was shifting, growing heavier, darker. The temperature dropped suddenly, their breath becoming visible in the frigid air. It was as if the warmth was being sucked out of the room, leaving only a bone-chilling cold in its wake. Then, the shadows began to move. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of darkness at the edge of Jack's vision. He blinked, convinced it was just his tired mind playing tricks on him. But then it happened again, more pronounced this time. The shadows cast by the dim light of the fire seemed to stretch and shift on their own, slithering across the walls and floor like living things. Jack's heart leaped into his throat. "Do you see that?" he whispered, barely able to get the words out. Mike nodded, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the creeping darkness. What's happening, Jack?" Jack didn't have an answer. He only knew that the cabin, their supposed safe haven, was turning against them. The shadows grew bolder, swirling around the edges of the room, as if testing the limits of their space. Outside, the wind began to howl, rattling the windows and making the entire cabin creak and groan. The temperature continued to plummet, the cold seeping into their bones, numbing their fingers and making it hard to think. Jack grabbed a flashlight, flicking it on and sweeping the beam around the room, hoping to dispel the encroaching darkness. But the light seemed feeble, swallowed up by the shadows as soon as it touched them. The walls seemed to close in, the space between them shrinking, tightening like a noose. "We need to do something," Mike said, his voice rising in panic. "We can't just sit here and let this thing happen." "What can we do?" Jack replied, his own fear bubbling to the surface. "We can't leave, not with that thing out there. We're trapped." Mike was on his feet now, pacing the small space, his eyes darting to the windows and the door as if searching for a way out. The shadows followed his movements, pooling at his feet, crawling up the walls. The air felt thick, oppressive, pressing down on them with an almost physical force. Jack could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The thought crossed his mind that they had disturbed something far older and more dangerous than they could comprehend, something that didn't belong in their world. And now, it was angry. Suddenly, the lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging the cabin into complete darkness. The fire in the hearth sputtered and died, leaving only the faint, ghostly glow of the moon filtering through the tightly drawn curtains. The shadows surged forward, enveloping the room in an inky blackness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. In the pitch-black cabin, Jack could hear the sound of something moving outside, a slow, deliberate scraping that made his blood run cold. The shadows pressed closer, as if they were being guided by whatever was out there, surrounding them, trapping them in a tightening circle. Jack reached out, fumbling in the darkness until his hand found Mike's. They held onto each other, their only anchor in the growing storm of terror that surrounded them. "We're not alone," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind and the sinister scraping outside. "It's here, Mike. Whatever it is, it's here." And in that moment, both of them knew that the cabin, once a sanctuary, had become their prison, a place where the darkness held sway, and the thing from the lake was waiting, just beyond the door. In the oppressive darkness of the cabin, with the shadows pressing in on all sides, Jack and Mike knew they couldn't just sit and wait for whatever was outside to break in. They needed answers. And the only place those answers might be found was in that cursed box they had foolishly pulled from the lake. With shaking hands, Jack retrieved the ancient box from the corner where they had shoved it, its surface cold to the touch, as if it had absorbed the chill of the air around them. The strange symbols etched into the wood seemed to writhe in the dim light, and as Jack brought the box closer to the table, he felt a deep, instinctual fear gnawing at him. But they had no choice now, they had to know what they were dealing with. "We need to figure out what this thing is," Jack said, his voice trembling but resolute. "Maybe there's something in here that can help us." Mike nodded, though his face was pale, and his eyes were wide with fear. "Just, let's be careful. We don't know what we're messing with." With great care, they opened the box again, its lid creaking as if in protest. Inside, the contents were just as they had left them, the ancient scrolls, the small stone figure, and a few other mysterious objects that looked like they had been lost to time. But now, in the flickering light of the lantern they had managed to relight, these items took on a more ominous significance. The air in the cabin seemed to thicken with a heavy, almost malevolent presence. They spread the scrolls out on the table, and as they did, they noticed something they hadn't before. The strange symbols on the scrolls bore a striking resemblance to the ones carved into the box, but they were more intricate, more detailed, as if they were telling a story. Mike, who had always had a knack for puzzles, began to carefully piece together the symbols, while Jack examined the stone figure more closely. As they worked, the room grew colder still, and the shadows seemed to pulse in time with their movements, as if urging them on. The figure was small, yet grotesque, with a twisted expression that seemed to change depending on the angle Jack looked at it. It felt ancient, older than anything Jack had ever seen, and as he turned it over in his hands, he noticed an inscription on the base, partially worn away by time. It was the same symbol repeated over and over again, a symbol that matched the one at the center of the scrolls. "Jack, look at this," Mike whispered urgently, his voice barely above a tremble. He pointed to one of the scrolls, where he had managed to decipher a section of the writing. The symbols told a story, a chilling tale of a cursed relic bound to the lake, a relic that was said to hold the spirit of a vengeful entity, trapped within it for centuries. The legend says that this spirit was bound to the lake by an ancient tribe that once lived in these woods, Mike explained, his voice shaking. They believed the spirit was too dangerous to roam free, so they used this box, this relic, to imprison it. The lake was supposed to be its eternal prison, and the tribe made sure no one would ever disturb it. Jack felt a cold dread settle over him. "But we disturbed it," he said, the weight of their actions crushing down on him. "We brought that box up from the depths, and now it's free." Mike nodded, his face pale. "The spirit, it's angry, Jack. And it's coming for us." As the realization set in, the cabin seemed to grow darker, the shadows pressing closer, as if the very air around them was alive with the spirit's wrath. They had unleashed something ancient and powerful, something that had been sealed away for good reason. And now, it wanted revenge. "We have to put it back," Jack said urgently, his mind racing. "We have to return the box to the lake, seal it again somehow, before it's too late." Mike agreed, though his fear was palpable. "But how? We don't even know how they did it. What if we make things worse?" Jack looked at the scrolls again, desperate for some clue, some instruction that might tell them how to reverse what they had done. But the writing was ancient, and the symbols were difficult to understand. They had little time, and even less knowledge of how to combat something so otherworldly. "We'll figure it out," Jack said, more to himself than to Mike. "We have to." But even as he said it, the cabin creaked ominously, the walls seeming to shudder as if in response to the spirit's growing power. The shadows danced menacingly around them, and the cold deepened, seeping into their bones. They could feel the spirit's presence, closing in on them, waiting for its moment to strike. They knew they had disturbed something that was meant to stay buried, something that was never supposed to be found. And now, they had to find a way to put things right, before the vengeful spirit took its full revenge, not just on them, but on anyone who dared to come near this cursed lake again. Time was running out, and the spirit's wrath was only just beginning. Midnight approached, and the cabin was deathly silent, save for the occasional creak of wood and the ominous whisper of the wind outside. The temperature had dropped even further, and both Jack and Mike could see their breath misting in the cold, unnatural air. They knew what had to be done, but the fear of what lay ahead made every step feel like a journey into darkness. They had spent hours poring over the ancient scrolls, desperately trying to decipher the instructions left by the long-forgotten tribe. The message was clear: the only way to re-imprison the spirit was to return the box to the depths of the lake and perform a ritual to seal it away once more. But the details were murky, the language difficult to understand, and they knew there was no room for error. The consequences of failure were too terrifying to contemplate. Jack packed the scrolls and the cursed box into a bag, his hands trembling with fear and cold. Mike, pale and silent, checked the flashlight and their knives, small comfort against a spirit that had already shown its terrifying power. They both knew they were woefully unprepared for what awaited them, but they had no choice. The spirit had to be stopped. "This is crazy," Mike muttered, his voice barely audible as they stepped out of the cabin and into the night. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the world in complete darkness. The only light came from their flashlights, casting long, eerie shadows as they made their way down to the lake. "I know," Jack replied, his voice grim. "But we have to try. If we don't, that thing will never stop. It'll kill us, and who knows how many others after us." The path to the lake was shrouded in darkness, and every step felt like walking into the unknown. The wind howled through the trees, making them sway and groan, as if the forest itself was alive and watching their every move. The closer they got to the water, the stronger the sense of dread became, a heavy weight pressing down on them, making it hard to breathe. When they finally reached the shore, the lake was eerily still, its surface like black glass reflecting nothing but the oppressive darkness. The water that had once seemed so inviting now felt like a portal to another world, a world where the spirit held dominion. "Let's get this over with," Jack said, his voice trembling as he set the bag down on the ground. He pulled out the scrolls and the box, his hands shaking as he unrolled the ancient parchment. The symbols seemed to writhe on the page, as if alive, but he forced himself to focus. Mike took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "You start the ritual. I'll get the boat ready." Jack nodded, though his stomach churned with fear. He began to chant the words written on the scrolls, his voice shaky but growing stronger as he continued. The language was ancient, foreign, but he could feel the power in the words, a connection to something far older than he could comprehend. As he chanted, Mike dragged the small rowboat to the edge of the water, its hull scraping against the rocky shore. The wind picked up, swirling around them in a frenzy, and the surface of the lake began to ripple as if something was moving beneath it. "Jack, hurry up!" Mike shouted over the rising wind, his eyes wide with fear as he watched the water. The lake was no longer calm, it was churning violently, as if in response to the ritual. The spirit knew what they were trying to do, and it wasn't going to let them succeed without a fight. Jack's voice grew louder, more desperate, as he continued the incantation. The box in his hands felt like it was vibrating, a dark energy pulsing from it, as if the spirit within was struggling to break free. The wind howled louder, and the water surged, splashing onto the shore and soaking their feet. Suddenly, the box jerked violently in Jack's hands, almost knocking him off balance. The ground beneath them shook, and a terrible roar echoed across the lake, a sound that sent chills down their spines. The spirit was here. Out of the corner of his eye, Jack saw something rise from the water, a dark, amorphous shape that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. It towered above them, a shadow-given form, its eyes glowing with a hatred that transcended time. The temperature dropped even further, the air turning frigid as the spirit drew closer, its presence suffocating. "Mike, get in the boat!" Jack yelled, his heart pounding as he forced the words of the ritual from his lips. He could feel the spirit's power closing in on them, trying to crush their will, to stop the ritual before it was too late. Mike didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled into the boat, his hands shaking as he grabbed the oars. Jack followed, clutching the box tightly as he jumped in after him. The boat rocked violently as Mike pushed off from the shore, the spirit's roar growing louder, more enraged. They rowed out onto the lake, the water churning beneath them, waves slamming into the sides of the boat. Jack continued to chant, his voice hoarse, barely able to keep the words straight as the spirit loomed closer, its form shifting and twisting in the darkness. "Faster, Mike!" Jack shouted, feeling the box grow colder in his hands, the energy within it intensifying. Mike rowed with all his strength, the boat cutting through the water as they headed for the center of the lake. But the spirit wasn't giving up. It surged forward, its massive form looming over the boat, tendrils of darkness reaching out, trying to drag them down into the depths. "Now, Jack! Do it now!" Mike screamed, his voice filled with terror as the boat was nearly capsized by a wave. Jack didn't hesitate. With a final, desperate shout, he completed the ritual, the last words of the incantation ringing out across the lake. He lifted the box high above his head and hurled it into the water with all his might. The box hit the surface with a splash, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, the water exploded in a furious maelstrom, waves crashing around them as the spirit let out a deafening roar of rage. The lake glowed with an unnatural light, the water swirling as if it was being sucked down into a vortex. The spirit thrashed violently, its form disintegrating as the power of the ritual took hold. The tendrils of darkness recoiled, the glowing eyes dimming as it was pulled back into the depths, back into the prison from which it had been freed. The roar of the spirit grew fainter, fading into the night as it was dragged down into the darkness of the lake. And then, suddenly, it was over. The lake calmed, the wind died down, and the oppressive cold lifted. The night was still once more, the only sound the gentle lapping of the water against the side of the boat. Jack and Mike sat there, breathing heavily, the silence almost as terrifying as the storm that had just passed. The box was gone, sunk to the bottom of the lake, and with it, the spirit that had haunted them. They had done it, they had ended the curse. But as they rowed back to shore, exhausted and shaken, they couldn't shake the feeling that they had only just survived by the skin of their teeth. The spirit was sealed away, but the memory of its wrath, the fear that had gripped their hearts, would never leave them. They had faced their deepest fears and come out alive, but they knew, deep down, that they would never truly be free of the curse of Lake Serpent.